Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Unpacking Illinois SB 1480 and the new equal pay requirements. Attendees will be in listen-only mode throughout the presentation, but you are encouraged to submit questions at any time by selecting the Questions tab within the Zoom control panel, typing in your questions and clicking Send. A follow-up email will be sent after today's presentation. Our speakers today will be Joanna Kim Brunetti and Mark Dwyer. Joanna, a former partner with Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, has over 20 years experience advising clients on a wide range of employment tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. Joanna holds a BS degree in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. She was president of the Korean American Bar Association, Rising Star Super Lawyers, co-chair of various committees under the American Bar Association and Los Angeles County Bar Association. Mark is Vice President of Data Science for Trusaic. He is responsible for evolving Trusaic's analytics regarding pay diversity and data consolidation processes as the company continues to scale and expand its robust data and analytic solutions. Mark has 16 years of experience in statistical analysis within class action litigation, and he has offered oral and written testimony regarding statistical modeling. Mark earned a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester, an MA in finance from the Wharton School, and a BA in physics from the University of Pennsylvania. He is a member of the American Economic Association and Econometric Society. And with that, I will turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you, Matt. So thank you for joining us today. And so today to discuss Illinois' SB 1480 and its equal pay requirements, it's going to be important to discuss the context within which that law arose, as well as the specifics of it, and then discussing how proactive pay equity audits is an important part of that law. And then we'll leave some time for questions and answers. I will cover the background and the problem, the landscape of pay equity laws, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark to discuss pay equity auditing, and then we'll get to questions. Okay, next slide. So let's first discuss the pay gap, the problem that Illinois SB 1480 seeks to address. Next slide. Okay, so there's two dimensions to this problem, and the first one is the gender pay gap. Basically, on average, men are paid more than women at every educational level, and this is data based on the U.S. Census Bureau data, Census Bureau for 2019. And as you can see, that the gender pay gap exists at every level, and more concerningly, that the gap widens with increasing educational levels. So you see from less than high school all the way to the advanced degree. Next slide. The other dimension of the pay gap problem is the pay gap based on race and ethnicity. And on average, white workers are paid more than Black and Hispanic workers at every educational level, except for high school, which is a curious anomaly. But if you look at it from high school degrees and onward, you see that there is a gap. And that, again, like the gap with gender, the gap gets worse as you go up an advanced degree. Okay, next slide. Now, if you look at both gender and race, when you look at that intersection, you see that women of color are affected by both forms of pay discrimination, and it compounds. So this is data collected from the National Women's Law Center, and pertaining to data specifically for 2019. And you see the gaps there from annual median losses as compared to the white male counterpart. And what this substantial difference in annual earnings translates to is, if you look at it on cents to the dollar as compared to the white male counterpart, for Black women, you're looking at 63 cents to the dollar. For Latinas, 55 cents to the dollar. For Native American women, 60 cents to the dollar. For Asian women, it's 87 cents to the dollar. So you see the pay gap exists, and this is on average. Now, next slide. So even if you actually achieve pay equity for a given job, there's also the diversity issue. And, you know, diversity sometimes seems like an amorphous concept, but really what we're talking about is representation in given position. So for a company, here's an example, a typical example, and this is focusing on gender only. So for a company, you might have folks at the executive level, which is at the highest tier of pay, and then down to associates, which is the lowest tier of pay. And here's a typical example where you see an overrepresentation of women at the lowest comp tier. And then when you go up to the executives, men seem to be overrepresented. So this is kind of the problem that diversity has, and it overlays on top of whether or not there's pay equity in a given job. If you look at this from a race ethnicity standpoint, you'll see a similar problem. And so we've got pay equity problems at a particular job classification, and we also have a lack of representation or diversity at higher paid jobs by non-white women. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So that's the problem. And with that, let's discuss what's been going on in the evolving pay equity landscape. Next slide. So the first aspect is, let's see what's going on federally here. We've got two federal laws that have been on the books for 60 plus years. You've got the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And at bottom, what they essentially say is that workers need to be paid the same wage for the same job and same conditions. While not precisely that strict, but that's roughly what we're talking about. And the defense to that an employer has available is that, well, if they're not being paid the same, the reason is justified based on one of these four factors. And that's seniority. That's basically somebody's been there longer than another person. So the reason why Susie's getting paid less than John is because Susie's only been there for a year and John's been there for 5 years. That's an example of seniority. Another one is merit. And merit would be, well, John has had better performance reviews than Susie. These are legitimate reasons why there would be apparent gender-based pay disparities or race or ethnicity-based pay disparities. A third factor is a system which measures earnings by quality, quantity, or production. And this is just a complicated way of saying, well, we get paid by the number of widgets processed. So like, for example, in an assembly line, pay is based on how many sprockets are clean, for example. And so the reason why Susie is getting paid less than John is that John cleans more sprockets than Susie. That's the third factor. The fourth factor, and where all the really kind of the gap in enforcement is this differential based on any factor other than sex. So on its face, it looks like, well, it's anything other than gender, at least in the equal pay context. In the Title VII context for race and ethnicity, it's any factor other than race ethnicity. So that's where there's been this large gap in enforcement, and I'm alluding to sort of what's been going on the state level. Okay, next slide. There's also, kind of flowing out of that federal law is the regulatory body, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And sort of following the heels of the Title VII Act, what happened was that they implemented this EE01 reporting. And what that is designed to collect workforce gender, race, ethnicity data from employers based on job classification. So basically how many people you have at the executive level, how many people you have at the staff level. And there's basically, I think roughly 12 different categories or 10 different categories. Anyway, there's a bunch of categories, and you're reporting how many workers you have based on gender and race ethnicity for each of those job categories. So, 50 years later, notwithstanding the fact that we've had this EE01 Component 1 reporting, that's the workforce gender demographics, we've still have had this pay gap. And so recognizing this persistent pay gap problem, in 2016, the Obama administration it started this Component 2 reporting. And what that is on top of the demographics data, they layered in pay data to see what's going on with regard to pay and why these pay gaps persist. However, when the Trump administration took over in the beginning of 2017, that Component 2 reporting was stalled after some litigation. That the net result was that component 2 reporting was instituted, but only for 2017, 2018. And that's important because that's going to lay out the groundwork for later, our discussion when we get into the meat of Illinois SB 1480. Now, with the new Biden administration, Component 2 may in fact be reinstated. And in part, we have Jenny Yang, who was the former commissioner for the EEOC, who is the one that advocated for the Component 2 reporting. She's back in the, fray in the related government agency of the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Program, the OFCCP. So that may actually come back, this Component 2 reporting at the federal level. Next slide. Other sort of recent federal activism that's been going on pertaining to pay equity. Just earlier this year, the FDIC has now requested financial institutions to submit self-assessments on their diversity policies. Also in the same time frame, 2 congresswomen have basically sent requests to U.S. investment firms seeking information about diversity and inclusion as well. And then thirdly, we have a congressional hearing that was pertaining specifically on diversity and the announcement they were going to introduce legislation to mandate diversity reporting. Okay, next slide. Okay, so across the pond mostly, when you look at it from an international standpoint, you'll see that just the last few years, there's been an acceleration of legislation to combat pay inequity, primarily in the areas of pay data or pay gap reporting and pay equity auditing. I mean, notably, it's been primarily a gender focus, but you see, basically the sort of what's going on, and the feds pay attention. But what's been going on internationally is that you have, countries in the U.S. eyeshot that are doing, moving legislation, advancing pay data reporting and pay equity auditing. And so that has a significant influence on the US. And notably, this has really all been going on the last 4 years. Next slide. Echoing that is what states have been doing. It's this recognizing that this persistent pay gap is not going to go away. Something more active needs to happen. And like internationally, in that same time frame, you have a bunch of states doing exactly that to push and advance pay equity. Among the ways that's achieving that, you've got a number of states, and not surprisingly, typically blue states. You've got the expansion of the definition of substantially similar or comparable work. As I alluded to earlier, that federal framework that's been on the books for 60 plus years is, in a nutshell, it's equal pay for equal work. And what these states have done is they've really kind of softened that. And what that means for employers is you're more vulnerable to pay discrimination claims, because you can a plaintiff can look at a broader cohort of employees to say, I should have been paid the same as that person or that group. Another significant area is really kind of constraining the affirmative defense against pay discrimination. I had mentioned there are 4 factors, sort of 4 legitimate factors to why Susie's getting paid less than John. A bunch of states, what they've done is they said that 4th factor, as I'd mentioned, it's this differential factor other than sex. And on its face, it looks like anything other than sex or anything other than race and ethnicity. What they've done is they've narrowed that, where that other factor still has to be job related and tied to business necessity. So it can't be just any old factors. There's got to be some legitimate reason for it to be connected as to why Susie's getting paid less than John. Another significant area is in salary history bands. And as part of Illinois SB 1480, there is in effect a salary history band. And what these are essentially is salary histories are not, you can't look at a person's salary history as part of a compensation decision for a new person that's coming on board. A fourth category is this equal pay safe harbor. And what some states have done is they have allowed employers to basically incentivize them to conduct a pay equity audit to see where pay disparities are. If they do that and make some type of reasonable progress, notably, they don't actually have to achieve pay equity, but as long as they're making reasonable progress, you can use that as a defense to certain state claims. In the Massachusetts case, it's a complete defense. In Oregon and Colorado, there are specific types of damages that a plaintiff would not be able to take advantage of if the employer has conducted these, pay equity audits. Next slide. Other trends in pay equity, there's diversity on boards in California. For example, they basically require representation by underrepresented minorities and women in publicly traded companies. And there's also pay transparency in New Jersey, Colorado, for example, where you have to, have some type of posting for what the job pays. In New Jersey, there's specifically pay reporting as well, but it is limited to contractors. Now, what the meat of it, what we're going to be talking about is Illinois, and Illinois, following the heels of California's SB 973, which is the first state to require mandatory pay data reporting. Illinois is now the second state to implement a similar, but albeit more draconian program. Okay, next slide. So I want to just briefly touch on California SB 973. This reporting is largely based on that EE01 Component 2 reporting. The one area that really adds some significant compliance issue is the non-binary aspect, where not only do you have to identify whether the workers are male or female, but if they also are in this non-binary category. So it adds a layer of compliance complication. One of the things that's really telling about this, and this is going to be alluded to in the Illinois SB 1480 reporting, is what does this pay data reveal? Like, essentially what you're doing is, like the EE01 Component 2 reporting, what you're basically doing is providing a report of how many workers you have in the different job positions, based on how much pay, also identifying how much pay they're getting over some time frame, and how many are in the, the different genders and the different races and ethnicities. So you're just looking at just a report of, how many people you have in each job classification, and the pay gap, the pay band that they fall into for the different races and genders. And so it's just raw data. There's zero accounting for legitimate business factors that are going to reduce those pay gaps, like justifications as to why Susie is getting paid less than John. And so that's a basically allowing the regulators, in this case, the California Department of Employment and Fair Housing, what it allows them to do is actually run the numbers to show that there is a significant disparity or pay gap amongst men and women and the races. It does, the SB 973 report actually provides for a comment section where you could try to explain that away, but that's really kind of a qualitative section, and it doesn't give you the ability to just really kind of crunch the numbers in there, and so it isn't a satisfactory solution. There's also the diversity that the pay data reveals, or lack thereof, because you're providing the demographics of how many workers you have in each race, ethnicity, gender, and job classification, and so the lack of diversity in the higher paid or higher level positions is going to be readily revealed. Next slide. Okay, so with that, let's focus on the Illinois SB 1480 reporting law. Okay, so next slide. So what are the key components? There's three key components. There's the equal pay registration certificate. There's the public-facing employee demographics reporting, and there's also protection against discrimination based on past history, conviction record. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's first talk about this registration certification. Now, who is affected akin to the EE01 Component 1 and Component 2 reporting. It's private employers with more than 100 employees. It is within state boundaries and excludes government agencies. There's no really specific detail of whether or not remote workers are going to count, or employees who telecommute. And that ended up being a significant issue for California, because it was broadly construed by the regulators enforcing it. And so we'll see whether or not SB 1480 has the same issue. And with COVID, that is becomes really significant with so many remote workers. Okay, so that's who's affected. Now, the next question is, well, when is the certificate required to be obtained? Basically, it's 3 years from enactment. So we're talking about, 3 years from now. So that's the good news. So 3 years from now, existing employers have to get the certificate, and then 2 years thereafter, they have to get recertified. If you're not in business last year, you're just a new business, meeting that employee threshold, it's going to be 3 years starting from the commencement of operations. And again, recertify every 2 years thereafter. Okay, next slide. So how does one apply for this equal pay registration certificate? There's 4 basic elements. You've got a filing fee. You have to submit this compliance statement. I'm going to get into that. You're going to submit that compliance statement with the Illinois Department of Labor. You're also going to submit the most recent EE01 report covering each Illinois facility and Illinois employees. You're also submitting a comprehensive list of all employees employed during the calendar year preceding the application. So if you're applying in, let's say you're applying in 2024, you would be submitting a list for 2023. And it's separated by gender, race, ethnicity, and wages for each employee. So this is hearkening back to that component 2 reporting that, at least at this juncture, is in abeyance. Okay, next slide. So what is this compliance statement? And this is a really big deal, because it's an affidavit with a number of attestations. It's going to be signed by an officer, legal counsel, or authorized agent that's basically certifying that the employer has complied with certain equal pay practices. So, well, what are the attestations? One is that you're complying with Title VII, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, as well as the Equal Pay Act of 2003, the Illinois Human Rights Act, and the Equal Wage Act. So you're going to have to make sure that you're confident that you are actually in compliance with those laws. That you're also saying that the average comp for female and minority employees is not consistently below the average comp for the male non-minority counterparts within each major job categories in the EE01. And importantly, quote, taking into account such factors of length of service, requirements of specific jobs, experience, skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions of the job, or other mitigating factors. Put another way, this is very similar to the affirmative defenses under Title VII and equal pay in the Equal Pay Act as to why Susie's getting paid less than John, or a white worker is getting paid more than their non-white counterparts. An additional certification is employees of one sex are not restricted to certain job classifications, and retention and promotion decisions are not made taking sex into account. That wages and benefit disparities are corrected when identified to ensure compliance with the above laws. So really all of this is really assuming that a pay equity audit is done. So the metrics of, what's going on is in fact average compensation, not consistently below when you compare it to female minority versus male non-minority. Are you, in fact, taking into account these legitimate business factors, if you will? All of that, you're saying yes. And so you're going to have to do pay equity analytics to determine whether or not that's true, because now you're certifying that. Importantly, this compliance statement you have to detail the frequency of and how compensation decisions are made, keeping in mind those 4 compensation categories of compensation setting practices. So this is, whether you're doing a market pricing approach, whether or not you're, subject to a union contract or prevailing wage requirement, performance pay system, internal analysis, alternative approach to determine what level of wages and benefits to pay its employees. So basically, you're attesting that you're in compliance. You've taken a look at all these factors, and based on those factors, there are no pay disparities, and you're also detailing sort of the method that you're actually using. So again, it's sort of baked into it is this need to do a pay equity audit. Okay, next slide. Well, what if you don't do that? Well, it's, the penalties, can be severe. According to the statute, it's equal to 1% of the business's gross profits. So this is, can be a huge deal. And of course, this is additive in the sense that if employees want to sue, they can. I mean, that's, it's independent of that. Next slide. Now, we've just covered that equal pay compliance statement. Separately, we're talking about the public-facing reporting that the Illinois employer is going to have to submit to the Illinois Secretary of State. What SB 1480 did was actually amend the Illinois Business Corporations Act to require this public reporting of employee demographic data. And that's really it's similar to the EE01 Component 1 reporting, which remains, in effect today. And different from the EE01 reporting Component 1 is that this is actually going to be published. So that's something to be mindful of. So basically, the public's going to be able to look at a business's level of diversity because they're going to see on Illinois' website gender, race, ethnicity data for the different job classifications for the company. And this is something that's going to be submitted along with annual corporate filings. They're basically filing that kind of information akin to the EE01 Component 1 report. Okay, next slide. And then the last element is of 1480 is the protection against conviction record discrimination. Basically, you can't use past history of conviction records as a basis for employment decisions in general, and it strengthens protections against employment discrimination for individuals with a criminal record. This is supporting the ban the box law. Okay, next slide. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over to Mark, who will discuss proactive pay equity auditing.
Great, thank you, Joanna. And welcome again to our webinar participants. Joanna just did a great job of showing us the foundations of Illinois SB 1480 and the requirements it's putting on employers with employees in Illinois to attest to the fact that they've achieved pay equity, essentially. So, we've seen in that certification, that EPRC certification, that employers basically have to attest to this. And it's difficult to see how employers can do that, can meet that challenge of that certification without examining pay equity in some way or form. So, and that's the purpose of a pay equity audit. It's to give you that foundation so that you have confidence in that certification and what you're attesting to. It allows employers to demonstrate that they've met the EPRC requirements there. So in a moment, I'm going to dive into some of the 9 essential elements that we believe are fundamental to a pay equity audit. But before doing so, I want to give you just a few more reasons, which are up right now, as to why it's good to do a pay equity audit outside of Illinois SB 1480. So there are basically 4 issues here that I'll just touch on briefly. So the first one is obviously that conducting a pay equity audit reduces regulatory and legal risk, both with respect to Illinois and with respect to other jurisdictions and federal federal equal pay requirements and international ones, though, as Joanna's described earlier. In addition to that, there are real academic studies, experimental studies that show that when employees believe they're being paid fairly, they perform better. You've got better attendance, better retention, better performance. And so a pay equity audit is a way of identifying and being concrete about what you're paying people for, and then considering making that as concrete and communicating that in a way that employees understand and can appreciate. And so we'll come back to this too, because it's important to measure whether those messages are hitting target or not in terms of inclusion metrics for employees as well. Okay, so the third piece here is a sort of a weird interaction between pay transparency laws and this prior point about perceptions of pay fairness, because as more and more states require and protect pay transparency, which is the ability of employees to share pay information, there's a potential that employees are going to get upset. They're going to see that, Bob's going to see that Jane's being paid more, or vice versa, and without a pay equity audit that says, okay, this is exactly why Jane is being paid more than Bob or whatever, and being able to communicate that to employees, pay transparency laws can actually exacerbate a sense of unfairness across employees. So pay equity audits help to address this rise of pay transparency laws. Then the final point is that there are other stakeholders besides regulators that care about pay equity, right? Obviously, we've touched on your employees and the notion of fairness, but also investors, your labor market. Okay, when you're in the labor market and you're trying to hire people, we all know that a sense of being able to say that you're an equitable organization, that employees will put a value on that. Employees prefer, and you can even put a dollar amount on that to work at a place where they feel that people are being equally treated. So those are all other reasons to consider a pay equity audit. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I promised, there are 9 essential elements coming up, and these are not them. This is just a preamble to that, which is before you even consider a pay equity audit, where to start. So PEA, pay equity audit. And what we advise is something that's pretty easy to undertake, which is basically we call it an equal pay risk assessment. It's a pay gap analysis. You're measuring pay gaps, and such a pay gap risk assessment measures the average differences in pay by gender and by race ethnicity for each location and for each job category. So that's a good start. This will provide an employer with a sense of the potential risks that a pay equity audit could address. Okay, the second point is based on those findings, those perceptions of gaps. The next question would be, okay, who do we want to identify as being part of this process? Who's going to carry the torch on this? Who's going to be the advocate for this? That's identifying those key participants. Number 3, once those participants are identified and motivation is laid for addressing these issues, and the Illinois law certainly provides some additional motivation for that. The next question is establishing privilege protocols. And I'll have more to say about that a little bit later, but we want to make sure that the pay equity audit, the law is requiring you to provide employee level wage data, but it's not requiring you to provide the analytics or the analysis of pay equity audit. And that's the piece that we want to maintain privilege over in particular. In addition to that, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but that in addition to something that's just focused just on pay equity, we also want to consider 2 interactive pieces with that, which is the inclusion survey and workforce dynamics analysis, which is something that evolves over time. I'll come back to those a little bit later, but these 3 key points right here are conduct a pay gap analysis, a pay risk assessment, identify key participants, and establish privilege protocols. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so now here is a big list. I'll break this down. I just wanted to get it all on one slide. So number 1, ensure data integrity, critical, right? If you don't have quality data going in, you're not going to have any competence or reliability in the analysis that comes out of it. Establish pay analysis groups. These are we'll talk some more about that, but that's a critical step that is often overlooked or given short attention, inadequate attention. Measuring legitimate pay differences. What are the drivers? What are the legitimate business drivers that drive pay differences? Then quantifying risk. That's going to be looking at the pieces that are not explained by legitimate pay differences and how to interpret those. Validating the findings. That's a critical piece of analysis. It's we'll see in a minute that running a regression is not enough. There's a lot more that goes into validating results besides just running a regression analysis. Investigating root causes. What's behind the pay equity? Any pay disparities, we would say. Anything that's we would call a disparity is something that's left over after you've controlled for differences in legitimate business factors. Okay, developing remediation strategies. How flexible is your approach, and how sophisticated is your approach in modeling and examining the impact of different remediation strategies? With that, you want to monitor how well they're doing and what other factors might be affecting pay disparities over time. And then again, you want to look for a solution, a pay equity audit solution that maintains privilege, legal privilege. That you want to have established in most cases. All right, so let's go through these a little bit more in detail. So number one, next slide, please, is on data integrity. So data quality is, as we've tried to illustrate here, the elephant in the room that pay equity audit solutions all too often ignore. Such data problems are not only time and resource intensive, in fact, they can be the most resource intensive and time intensive part of the pay equity audit for employers to do it themselves. They make pay equity audits less accurate, obviously, and can lead to, if you follow what the bad data is telling you, you can lead to remediation strategies that are off target and maybe counterproductive. So given it time limitations, we're just going to highlight, I'll just say one other thing. Then one of the complications with data is that it can be in a structured or an unstructured format. Structured formats are things that are in databases and tables, in spreadsheets. Unstructured sources are things that are in documents, resumes, job descriptions that need to be pulled in and assembled to give us a good view of what are the drivers of pay differences. Then we have a set of factors here which are about data quality and data checks. And it's something that we've developed working with many clients over many years, this sort of checklist. And we don't have time to go through it in detail, but I would just say that data inconsistencies on completeness, obvious, there's more to completeness than you might think. There are different degrees of completeness. Then there's the issues of completeness and consistency. And that has to do with consistency from one source to another. We're getting the same data for the same individual from different sources. Oftentimes we are not, and that's because some databases are set up as this is they just tell you what the state is right now, and other data is historical, right? And so being able to identify that inconsistency where you're saying someone last year was paid X, but you only know what their job title is now, those kinds of inconsistencies you try to be able to spot. But validity and influence, right? So is the data even valid? And if the data, pardon me, is unusual in some way, someone's high or low paid, or they have they're out there on the time with the company, the seniority spectrum or something, they're going to have they may have a lot of influence on the results. So we want to make sure that those points are valid. Interpretations of data is critically important. These last 2 points, interpretation and identifying differences in compensation philosophies, those are of critical significance, and it's more than just sort of blindly doing automated data checks. You really need to know what the data represents, how to interpret it, and that it's being modeled correctly given that interpretation. So what do differences in performance reviews mean? What does it mean when someone doesn't have a performance review? Are there differences in the sets of people who don't have performance reviews? And just a host of questions like that in terms of interpreting data, and that also interacts with the completeness of data. So a lot of issues there under the hood on making sure the data is right, and that's the first critical step in a pay equity audit. Next slide, please. So constructing groups, right? So this is getting at this what we call what are called pay analysis groups. So a pay equity audit typically breaks employees of a workforce, of the whole workforce, into different subsets of employees for separate statistical analyses. These separate groups are called pay analysis groups because you're conducting separate pay analyses for these different groups. Many pay equity solutions offer little or no guidance on how an employer should construct these groups. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about conducting a pay equity audit. Does the pay equity audit option just leave the construction of these groupings up to the employer with like no guidance? Or does it provide statistical evaluations and guidance regarding which pay analysis groups are justifiable? So you come up with a set of groupings. Are they significantly different from one another? Are they justified on a statistical basis? Is a grouping that you've constructed stable, or should it be broken into smaller groups, right? Are there inconsistencies within that group? Statistics can help with that. There are tests that can help with both of those questions. But most pay equity solutions, and certainly do-it-yourself pay equity solutions, don't give you those tools. Next slide, please. Okay. So then once you've assembled the data, both the pay data and the data on legitimate factors, such as employee characteristics and job characteristics, you want to measure what influence the latter set, these legitimate business factors have on pay differences. Okay, so how much of a pay difference between two employees is due to the fact that they're in different positions, or that they have different tenure, or that they bring different skill sets. Okay. So, and there's a subtlety here that I want to bring up, which is related to the fourth bullet point, which is this issue of disparate impact. Okay, so I'll just come back to that order. But let me just say, statistical significance is required of legitimate business factors by most regulatory authorities. You can't have legitimate business factors in there that just have very weak explanatory power. They have to be shown to really be driving differences in compensation. And how you arrive at that demonstration that those factors like tenure, reviews, location are statistically significant, that matters. Okay, regulators pay attention to that, and there are ways. You may have heard the term P hacking, where that infects some pay equity audit solutions as well, where the results are driven. The outcomes drive the results, which is completely invalid from a statistical perspective or methodology, but it happens a lot. So you have to be able to guard against that, where you've looked at some disparities and you say, oh, well, if I tweak it this way, they go away. Well, why now do you have that final specification? Okay, it's just because you wanted to make something go away, right? And that doesn't fly with regulators. So statistical significance has more than just looking at a p-value. Then I would also now get back to this disparate impact issue, which is the very fact that a legitimate factor explains much of a gender or race pay gap. Okay, so we see a 10% pay gap between men and women, but when we control for legitimate business factors, it goes down to 3%, let's say. Okay, which is a real example that we just had. That can be an indication that the organization's policies have disparate impact on gender, on women in particular. So, for instance, as a race example, is the average level significantly different between whites and Hispanics? The average job level, not the average compensation level, but the average job level. So now, if it is, then job level would be explaining part of the compensation difference between whites and Hispanics. But this difference may be, and the difference in job level may be outside of an employer's responsibility if it reflects differences in training or aptitudes in candidates for various positions. But alternatively, it might be indicative of a problem with promotion opportunities or promotion procedures. And that's this disparate impact issue. So it's a flip side. The more of a gap you can explain with legitimate business differences, the more potential issues there are with avenues for disparate impact. And that's one of the things that a pay equity does, is that it not only, or what a pay equity you should look for in a pay equity, is that it prioritizes. It tells you which of your legitimate factors is most important to this pay difference between men and women. Okay, because of this dual nature of legitimate business factors, that they help explain the pay difference and reduce it, but at the same time, they raise an issue about disparate impact. You want to know which ones to focus on, right? Is it seniority? Maybe there's a problem with retention, right? Or is it level, right? And maybe there's a problem with promotion. So which of those factors is really absorbing a lot of that pay gap? You want to know that, and a pay equity solution should tell you that. Okay, That's what we mean by priorities. Next slide, please. Okay. Measuring risk. So that's the other part of this now. So we've explained a lot of wage variation, compensation variation by legitimate business factors. The next question is, what's left over? Is it economically significant? Is it statistically significant? And then you want to be able to look at that from multiple perspectives, like not just what it is across the whole workforce, but what it is by department, by division, by any other groupings that are a part of your organizational structure. And then you want to be able to measure that at a bunch of different levels as well, in terms of annual differences, hourly differences, and even at the individual employee level. How much are they off from what we would predict they would be paid? And so a pay equities audit solution should give you that information as well. Next slide, please. Right, validating findings. This is where regressions are not enough. You run a regression, you get a result, you see you have a male-female disparity of 3%. Should you believe that? Or maybe you see the opposite, right? Maybe you see that men are down relative to women, right? So should you believe that? That's what the statistics are telling you. The legitimate business factors are statistically significant. Should you now start cutting checks, right? Raising wages for people. Well, we offer, and in general, one should look for a variety of checks on that, okay? So when we're just listing them out here, don't have time to go through them, but cohort comparisons, do they align and do they support what you're seeing in the regression analysis? If the regressions varied by the inclusion of different and exclusion of different business factors, is the effect robust there? Is it robust to those people with extreme values, right? So people with very long seniority or very short seniority or somewhere in between. If we take them in and out, now we're not excluding them from the analysis, right? But we're testing the analysis to see what impact they have. Okay, so I don't have too much time to go through these, but there's also your organizational context. Then there's this issue of alternative interpretations, and statistics actually helps you with that, believe it or not. It gives you additional data points that allow you to think, okay, is this potentially an issue with, are we leaving some legitimate business factors out of this that we haven't accounted for? Is that how likely is that something we want to explore before we start changing compensation? You want to make, and again, and what we haven't maybe stressed yet is that pay equity is making internal comparisons, right? And in terms of its wage comparisons, are people within the organization paid equitably with respect to one another? When you get results from regression analysis, you also want to compare them to external market benchmarks. And then also are measures of pay disparities, unexplained pay differences, robust to alternative measures of compensation, such as base salary, base compensation versus a total comp measure versus equity awards and all that kind of thing. So you want to see whether those additional elements of compensation tend to exacerbate, are neutral with respect to pay disparities, or whether they tend to reduce them. Okay, next slide, please. Right, along with, so once findings are validated, you find a pay disparity, there's a potential to remediate it with compensation adjustments, but you really want to know why it's there, right? And so another element of a pay equity audit is it should really try to drill down and provide some guidance, some indicators of what the potential root causes could be. And that can be found by looking within a group like, say, Black women, right, are at a disadvantage in terms of pay based on the analysis. It would be to look within that group of Black women and say, okay, within that group, is there a concentration where the problem is worst, the worst cases of underpayment, right, at least as we predict, right, from the analysis. And if so, what's the commonality among those people, right? So we look at time and looking at it from a time perspective. Okay, is it something that there's an attempt to, in certain circumstances with enough data, we can decompose pay disparities between growth in pay and initial pay, right? Maybe some of these pay differences are legacy pay from earlier cohorts, right? And pay that was not in alignment when they were hired, right? And then you want to be able to parse it from an organizational level perspective. So can you concentrate it within an organizational level and sort of pinpoint where the issues may arise. So that's this idea. These indicators, these signposts to the underlying issues are also important as a pay equity audit component. Right, and then number 7 are pay equity audit solutions. Again, there's a lot here. So in the event that pay equity, sorry, the next slide, thank you. We'll get some color in our slides here. In the event that pay disparities are detected, next question is what to do about them. So we believe that a pay equity audit solution should give you a forward-looking, multi-pronged remediation strategies, multiple strategies, and we're referring both to compensation and non-compensation responses here. The equal pay reporting certification requires evidence of what the employer has done to address identified disparities, and that has to do with pay equity audit solutions. So we're not going to be able to go into much detail here, but you want something that you can filter. You can tailor remediation solutions by department or by line of business. You have different strategies, whether you're going to be remediating just affected protected classes, like for instance, in that example, like Black women, or are you going to remediate anybody who's predicted to be low, right? So those are different options. You want to have a tool that allows you to see what the impact of making compensation adjustments is. What effect does that have on your disparities? You want something that gives you some phased options where you don't have to do everything all at once. You can take incremental steps and then see how things evolve over the next year or so. And that's where we come to this notion of tracking as well. And that brings us to our next slide, number 8 on our list of 9, getting through these. So if pay disparities are identified, the proper pay equity audit should also allow employers to monitor those pay differences over time. And we just saw that if you made compensation adjustments, you want to see what their impact is. Ongoing monitoring will allow you to see what the effect of those are and to track them over time so that you can see how they're evolving and not be just surprised a year or two later where pay disparities have resurfaced. You thought you wiped them out, now they're back again. Ongoing monthly monitoring or quarterly monitoring will give you a heads up as things progress. And as well, so what else is driving it besides changes that you make in compensation? Are just simply changes in your workforce. So people get promoted, people get transferred, people leave the company, there are new hires, there are varieties of the different genders and races in those movements. And so that's going to affect your overall pay equity situation as well. And monitoring helps you track that. Okay, next slide. Okay, we get back to privilege. That's where we started with when we're talking about the sort of starting points for pay equity audit. So while employee data, we saw the employee wage data, right, at the employee level are being provided to the Illinois Department of Labor under the SB 1480, the pay equity analysis that you presumably would have done as the foundation for your certification has not been provided to them, okay? Employers should keep their options open by protecting the pay equity audit under attorney-client privilege. So the pay equity audit solution, obviously, having a set of people ill-defined within your organization, running regressions, is not a great way to protect privilege, right? It's better to have these formal privilege protocols set up. So the recommended approach to proactive pay equity auditing is to consider the audit as a component of legal advice, okay? And then it's under the notion of attorney-client privilege. It's prudent for employers to ask their internal or external counsel for advice regarding litigious and regulatory risk raised by pay equity potential disparities. So to be meaningful, that legal advice needs obviously to be grounded in the specific compensation decisions that an employer's made. A pay equity audit provides that grounding. Okay, so conducting from this perspective, the pay equity audit be counsel directed, and it's to provide legal advice to the client, which is the employer. A pay equity audit solution should be able to maintain those privilege protocols that are agreed to by an employer and their legal counsel. So with that, we come to what we call the triangle of trust. All of the 9 elements that we've been talking to are reflective of these 3 elements: regulatory expertise, analytic expertise, and data expertise. So it's difficult for employers to assemble in-house expertise in regulations, analytics, and data integrity. Sorry, yes, next slide with our triangle of trust. Thank you. For the purposes to assemble these three components, right? This is a lot of specialization to put together for the purposes of conducting a pay equity audit. For this reason, we recommend employers to consider external partners when undertaking pay equity audits. By their nature, pay equity audit solutions also measure employee diversity, something else that's not only being reported under SB 1480, but being made public, right? While we don't have time to go into it in terms of meeting social and corporate governance responsibilities as well, employers should look for partners who also provide inclusion sentiment and workforce dynamics. Those are those two elements I mentioned earlier, because they interact with pay equity. They help to support pay equity in terms of do employees recognize that they're being paid equally when you've established that there is equal pay. If not, the inclusion sentiment will reveal that, and you can address the communication issue there, right? And then it also can affect diversity, right? So if there are negative inclusion sentiments, that could be affecting hiring, okay? Or it might be reflective of problems with promotion and retention. Okay, so again, we recommend that it's helpful to have an external partner for those, to give you those 9 elements that we think are critical to a pay equity audit. So with that, I think we're ready for our poll question, which is, are you interested in learning more about how a pay equity audit can prepare your organization for Illinois SB 1480 reporting, the upcoming reporting requirements? And while our participants, our webinar participants are responding to that, Joanna, do we have any questions from them that we could address?
Yes. One question that was asked is, how often does a company need to do a pay equity audit? The questioner has employees getting hired, leaving, promoting, etc. So how often should a pay equity audit be conducted?
Yeah, so it's really, I think, best to conduct that annually with ongoing monitoring. So those are two critical pieces to it. You don't want to be rerunning regressions every month. You're going to get randomness in your answers that is just going to be misleading. It's better to anchor it once a year to allow for changes in your compensation philosophy or your structure of compensation decisions that accumulated over a year. But then it sounds like this questioner may have a relatively high turnover in segments of their workforce, and that can have a big impact on pay equity and pay disparity. So that's why the monthly monitoring based on an annual pay equity analysis is also probably pretty important for that in that context.
Kind of following up on that question is, if the Illinois SB 1480 is requiring this kind of recertification after 2 years, and the first one, 3 years from now, how does that play into this, annual pay equity audit?
Right. Well, yeah. So you've got to make these attestations to certify that you've conducted these pay equity audits and that you've responded to them, right? And so by conducting these audits annually and conducting ongoing monitoring as well to see how things are progressing, you can in full faith say that you're in compliance, because you're really trying to address the problem, and you're keeping resources devoted to that, right? And keeping an eye on it, because for instance, if you did a pay equity audit and then wait 2 years, now certification's up again, you may not have time to get it done at that point, right? So, and you don't know what it's going to show, and then suppose it shows disparities. Well, you haven't addressed the requirement that you've done something to deal with those issues, right? So you need that, I think, that interim annual analysis in particular to recalibrate and to be able to say in good faith that you're making progress on any disparities that have been identified.
Okay, so the fact that the reporting would be done, or certification, every 2 years should not lull employers to think that they only have to pay attention to it every couple of years. That's
right. That's
okay.
Right.
Okay.
Because the requirement is that you respond to any issues you find as well, right?
Right.
So it's not just reporting that I have a problem; it's reporting that I've done something about it.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Should I, do you want to do the poll question, or should I ask another question?
Do we have the poll? I'm sorry, I don't have the, the poll question
Okay,
results?
well, we can go to the next question.
Yes.
So the question kind of relating to what you were asking earlier is how concerned should a company be by the submitting the SB 1480 data without actually doing a full pay equity audit?
Right. Well, certainly you're submitting detailed pay data, right, at the employee level to a regulator, and they're and just opening yourself up for evaluation to companies of similar size in your industry, to your competitors, to see how you stack up. And and you're just going into that blind without conducting a pay equity audit. And in addition, I don't know how you answer the attestation, sorry, I have trouble with that word, in the certification, right, without having actually conducted a pay equity audit. Because it pretty much is basically saying, have you conducted a pay equity audit?
Right, right. Okay, so we're out of time. So there are some questions that we haven't answered. We will answer all questions in written form. So with that, let me turn it over back to Matt.
Thank you, Joanna and Mark, for that great presentation. And thank you to our audience for attending our webinar today, Unpacking Illinois SB 1480 and the new equal pay requirements. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Like Joanna said, a follow-up email will be sent after today's presentation with our contact information, the PowerPoint presentation, and answers to all the questions unanswered and answered by today's presenters. This concludes today's program, and you may now disconnect.